Well, I don't know about you, but Peter has got to be my favorite disciple. All throughout the Gospels, we see this guy who so desperately wants to follow Jesus. But time and time again, Peter keeps messing things up. He's constantly putting his foot in his mouth, he's impulsive, and he keeps failing to see and to understand the bigger picture. And the reason I think I like him so much is because, well, he's so relatable. We can clearly see that Peter's heart beats for Jesus. But he's also human and he makes mistakes and falls short, just like us. And in our passage this morning, we see Peter do something absolutely remarkable, but then he fumbles with it. Now, starting in Matthew 14, verse 22, Jesus had just finished feeding the 5,000 and had told his disciples to get into their boat and head to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the people and spent some time alone praying. Later in the evening, when the boat was far from shore, the wind and the waves start beating against it. Now, even for an experienced fisherman, this would have been a pretty rough night. Then, as dawn approached, the disciples spot this mysterious figure out on the waves. And immediately, they jump to the conclusion that it's a ghost, and they start to panic. But Jesus' words powerfully transcend the noise of the wind, the waves, and the disciples' panicked cries. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Now, almost predictably, Peter pipes up and says, Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water. Now, this sounds like a very Peter thing to say, doesn't it? And I've wondered where such a request would have come from. Maybe Peter's thinking back to that time in Matthew 8 when they were on their boat in the middle of a storm, and Jesus demonstrated his power over nature by calming the storm. Or perhaps Peter, being unsure, wanted some sort of assurance that this was in fact Jesus and not a ghost by asking for something seemingly impossible. Or maybe Peter, in a way that reminds me of something maybe one of our junior highs would do, saw an opportunity to try something really cool and didn't want to miss out. But in any case, Jesus tells Peter to come. Now imagine with me as Peter begins to scramble out of the boat, carefully putting one foot on the water, and then the other, and then very cautiously letting go of the side of the boat. And then there he is in the middle of a lake, standing on the water. And with the waves swelling at his feet and the wind swirling around him, Peter begins to walk towards Jesus. How incredible! I can only imagine the thoughts going through Peter's mind, through the disciples' minds. Now, if this was to happen today, you can be sure the disciples would have had their phones out recording this for YouTube or for TikTok. And for Peter's sake, it's a good thing they didn't because, well, things start to go south pretty quick. And it all starts when Peter takes his eyes off of Jesus and starts to focus on the wind and the waves. And again, almost predictably, Peter starts to sink and cries out for Jesus to save him. Now, immediately and also predictably, Jesus reaches out his hand and grabs Peter. You of little faith, Jesus says. Why did you doubt? Now, at first reading, Jesus' words almost seem to have a tone of reprimand to them, don't they? It seems like Jesus may be condemning Peter for his lack of faith, for his doubts, and for, well, you guessed it, for messing up again. Something I think many of us might assume that Jesus says to us when we fall into sin and come to him again and again and again for forgiveness. But is that what Jesus is meaning here? Well, in my research into this passage, I couldn't find a conclusive answer to the tone and inflection of Jesus' words. So I'd like to offer my own thoughts on what I think Jesus may have meant here. Now, first of all, Jesus says that Peter had little faith. But let's not mistake that as Jesus saying that Peter had no faith. After all, Peter was the only one who had the boldness, the courage, and indeed the faith to step out of the boat into the middle of a rough sea. Further, it was Peter himself who made the request. So clearly Peter had faith, but it was small and fickle at this point. Now, Jesus also asks, why did you doubt? And I don't think Jesus was asking that question so much for his own edification, as I'm pretty sure Jesus knew exactly what had happened. Peter had this small amount of faith as he made his big request, and as Jesus saw firsthand, Peter took his eyes off of him and started to focus on the wind and the waves and began to sink as fear replaced his faith. It seems to me then that Jesus was asking this question more for Peter to reflect on. Now, in my own experience with working with youth, I've learned that one of the best ways to teach is to not just lecture and not just to give out answers, but to ask good questions to help them think through the material. And I think that's perhaps what Jesus was doing here. And I think Peter would have spent the rest of that trip thinking through that question. Why did I doubt? Why did I take my eyes off of Jesus? Now, was Jesus frustrated with Peter? Well, possibly. But I don't think Jesus was raking Peter over the coals, though, either. And I also think that despite sinking, Jesus probably admired Peter's attempt to begin this whole thing to begin with. Remember that Jesus called Simon to become Peter, the rock on which he would build his church. He didn't take Simon on as a disciple because of who he currently was, but because of who he knew Peter would become through the empowering of the Spirit. And such a process would take time and patience, understanding, and an occasional drying off. Now, the passage ends by mentioning that those in the boat worshiped Jesus and remarked, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So as a result of this whole experience, the disciples' faith increased, God was glorified, and Peter learned a lesson he'd never forget.